with bullets ricocheting off canyon walls. Mason froze as the blindfolded woman he just rescued grabbed his face and gasped his name, recognizing the voice of a man she'd mourned for 8 years. Her fingers trembled against his stubbled cheek as she whispered, "They told me you were dead," words that shattered his world more violently than the gunfire still hunting them. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Under the merciless sun of the Arizona Territory, Mason Reed rode with slow, steady determination, his weathered hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the relentless glare. His dun mare kicked up dust with each plodding step, the only sound for miles save for the occasional cry of a distant hawk. Mason's once proud shoulders now slumped beneath the weight of failure and debt, his ranch slipping through his fingers like the fine desert sand. 3 years of drought had withered his dreams along with his cattle. 2 months past, he'd buried the last of his herd in a dry creek bed, watching as the parched earth swallowed what remained of his future. Now, with the bank's final notice crumpled in his saddlebag, he rode toward Copperhead Junction with little more than his father's revolver and a desperate plan to win enough at cards to buy himself another month of borrowed time. The winding trail through Rattlesnake Canyon was dangerous but direct. Most travelers avoided it, fearing the steep cliffs and narrow passages where bandits were known to lurk. Mason had neither the luxury of caution nor extra ammunition to waste on trouble. He simply needed to reach town before nightfall. He was halfway through the narrowest part of the canyon when he heard it, a woman's scream, sharp and desperate, echoing off the stone walls. Mason reined his horse to a stop, muscles tensing as he listened. The sound came again, followed by rough male laughter and the muffled thud of something hitting the ground. "Ain't nobody coming for you, lady," a voice called out, thick with cruel amusement. "Might as well stop fighting and make this easier on yourself." Mason's hand moved to his revolver, checking the chambers. 5 bullets. Not much against what sounded like at least 3 men. The smart play was to ride on, to pretend he'd heard nothing. His own troubles were burden enough without taking on someone else's fight, and yet he couldn't move. Something in that scream had pierced through the armor of indifference he'd built around his heart these past years. With a soft curse, he dismounted, tethering his mare to a twisted juniper. Gun drawn, he moved silently through the rocks, following the sounds of struggle until he reached a small clearing between 2 towering rock formations. The scene before him made his blood run cold. 3 men in dusty clothes surrounded a woman who lay sprawled in the dirt, her dress torn and dirty, her wrists bound before her. A cloth was tied around her eyes, but even blindfolded, she held herself with a dignity that struck Mason like a physical blow. Her hair was the color of midnight, cascading in waves around shoulders that trembled but did not cower. "Check her bags again," ordered the tallest of the men, a scarred brute with a shock of red hair. "There's gotta be more than just these trinkets." "I've told you," the woman said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I have nothing of value. The stagecoach passengers took everything when they left me behind." "Lying, bitch," the redhead snarled, drawing back his hand to strike her. Mason's shot kicked up dirt at the man's feet before he could land the blow. All 3 bandits whirled, hands flying to their weapons. "Next one goes through your skull," Mason called out, stepping into view, his revolver trained on the leader. "Back away from the lady." The redhead's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your business, mister. Ride on if you want to keep breathing. I'm making it my business." Mason kept his voice level, though his heart hammered against his ribs. 3 men against 1 blind woman doesn't seem sporting. The smallest of the bandits, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, spat in the dirt. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you. Those odds ain't much better." Mason smiled thinly. "Difference is, I've got nothing to lose. Do you boys feel that lucky today?" A moment of tense silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sound of the woman's breathing. Then the leader nodded almost imperceptibly, and the bandits drew their guns in unison. Mason fired twice in rapid succession. The first shot caught the redhead in the shoulder, spinning him backward. The second struck the pockmarked man's gun hand, sending his weapon flying. The third bandit got off a wild shot that whistled past Mason's ear before Mason's bullet found his thigh, dropping him to the ground with a howl. "Leave your weapons and go," Mason ordered, his gun steady despite the tremor of adrenaline in his veins. "Don't make me waste my last bullets." The wounded men staggered to their feet, the leader clutching his bleeding shoulder. "This ain't over," he growled. "It is for today," Mason replied evenly. He kept his gun trained on them until they disappeared around the canyon bend, their curses fading into the hot afternoon air. Only then did he holster his weapon and approach the woman, who had remained perfectly still throughout the confrontation. "Ma'am, they're gone now. Are you hurt?" He knelt beside her, reaching for the blindfold. "Please," she whispered, turning her face away. "Leave it. The sun. My eyes can't bear it." Mason paused, then reached for the ropes binding her wrists instead. "I understand. Let me free your hands at least." As he worked at the knots, he noticed the delicate curve of her wrists, the soft hands that bore no calluses of hard labor. This was no frontier woman, but someone used to comfort and care. "Thank you," she said softly as the ropes fell away. She rubbed her chafed wrists, then reached up to adjust the blindfold, ensuring it remained in place. They took the stagecoach driver and the other passengers. "Left me behind because I was ... single quotes. She hesitated. A burden. People can be cruel, Mason said simply. I'm Mason Reed. I can escort you to Copperhead Junction if that's where you were headed. She stilled at the sound of his name, her breath catching. Mason Reed, she repeated, her voice suddenly strained. From Willow Creek? It was Mason's turn to freeze. How do you know that? Her hands trembled as they reached toward his face, fingertips hovering inches from his cheek. Your voice, ... I would know it anywhere, even after all these years. Mason stared at her blindfolded face, confusion giving way to dawning recognition as memories stirred. That midnight hair, the graceful hands, the voice that had once whispered promises beneath a summer moon ... Eleanor? He breathed, the name catching in his throat. Eleanor Montgomery? Her fingers finally made contact with his face, tracing the lines that years of hardship had carved there. They said you were dead, he whispered. They told me you died in the war. Mason caught her hand in his mind reeling. Eleanor Montgomery, the banker's daughter, the woman he'd loved, the one he'd left behind when he rode off to fight, promising to return and make her his wife, the woman who'd married another man barely 6 months after he'd gone. Not dead, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Just dead to you, it seems. Her face crumpled at his words, tears seeping from beneath the blindfold. Mason, no, you don't understand, I thought. But whatever explanation she might have offered was cut short by the distant sound of hoofbeats, many of them growing louder by the second. They're coming back, Mason muttered, helping Eleanor to her feet. And they've brought friends. He gathered her possessions quickly, slinging her small traveling bag over his shoulder before lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, fitting against his chest as though she belonged there. The thought sent a pang through him that he refused to examine. Hold tight, he instructed, carrying her swiftly back to where his mare waited. We need to move fast. As he lifted her onto the saddle, the bandits rounded the bend behind them, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. Mason swung up behind Eleanor, one arm securing her against him as he urged the horse forward into a gallop, with the woman he'd once loved pressed against his chest and men who wanted them dead in pursuit. Mason Reed rode deeper into the canyon, wondering if he just saved Eleanor Montgomery or ensured both their deaths. Mason's mare strained beneath their combined weight, hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth as they fled deeper into the labyrinth of Rattlesnake Canyon. Behind them, the bandits' shouts grew more distant, but Mason knew better than to slow their pace. Quote, these men knew the terrain far better than he did, and the winding passages offered as many traps as they did escape routes. Eleanor clung to him, her body tense against his chest. The years had changed her, made her thinner, more fragile, but the scent of her hair still carried traces of lavender, just as it had when they'd walked through her father's garden all those years ago. They're falling behind, Mason said, his voice low near her ear, but we need to find somewhere to hide. My horse can't outrun them forever. Eleanor nodded, her face half turned into his shoulder. There should be an old mining settlement somewhere in these canyons. Silver Creek. I heard the stagecoach driver mention it before, she broke off, her voice catching. Mason guided the horse around a sharp bend, eyes scanning the rugged walls for any sign of a trail or shelter. His mind worked furiously, torn between the immediate danger and the storm of questions Eleanor's presence had stirred. Why was she here, traveling alone? What had happened to her eyes? And most pressing of all, why had she married James Harrington so quickly after Mason had gone to war? A bullet ricocheted off the canyon wall to their left, sending stone chips flying. Mason cursed, urging the mare forward with greater urgency. They're catching up, Eleanor whispered, her fingers digging into his arm. Mason spotted a narrow cleft in the rock face ahead, barely visible behind a stand of scrub brush. He directed the exhausted horse toward it, praying it wasn't a dead end. Hold on, he instructed, ducking low as they squeezed through the opening. The passage widened into a small box canyon, its floor covered with sparse grass and bordered by steep walls on 3 sides. At the far end stood the crumbling remains of what must have been Silver Creek, a few wooden structures in various states of collapse. Abandoned mining equipment scattered like the bones of long-dead beasts. Mason dismounted quickly, then lifted Eleanor down. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she clutched at his shirt to steady herself. We need to hide the horse, he said, leading the mare toward a half-collapsed shed, and find somewhere defensible. Eleanor nodded, one hand extended slightly before her as she tried to orient herself. How many were following us? I counted 5, Mason replied grimly, and they looked determined. He secured the horse inside the shed, then returned to Eleanor, taking her elbow to guide her toward what appeared to be the most intact structure, a small cabin with its roof mostly still in place. Once inside, Mason helped Eleanor to a rough-hewn bench while he assessed their situation. The cabin had 2 windows, their glass long gone, and a single door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Not ideal, but better than being caught in the open. We have maybe minutes before they find this place, he said, checking his revolver. 3 bullets left, not nearly enough. I need to know what they want, Eleanor. Why were they so intent on your bags? Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. I don't know, truly. Perhaps they simply thought a blind woman traveling alone would be carrying something valuable. Mason studied her face, what he could see of it beneath the blindfold. She'd never been able to lie to him. Her lips would press together just so. A small tell he'd found endearing once. They were pressed together now. Eleanor, he said, his voice hardening, I'm risking my life for you. Don't lie to me. She flinched as if struck. You always could read me, she whispered. Then with a small sigh, she reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a small leather pouch. This is what they want. Mason took it from her outstretched hand. Inside was a folded document sealed with wax, and what appeared to be a map, its edges worn from handling. What is this? The deed to a silver mine? Eleanor replied softly. One that was never fully tapped. My husband, she paused, swallowing hard. James discovered it shortly before he died. Mason stared at the documents, then at Eleanor. James is dead? She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. 3 months ago, pneumonia took him quickly. Mason absorbed this information silently, unsure what he was supposed to feel. He'd hated James Harrington with a passion that had sustained him through the darkest days of the war, the rich man who had stolen Eleanor while Mason bled on distant battlefields. I'm sorry for your loss, he finally managed, the words feeling strange on his tongue. A bitter smile touched Eleanor's lips. Are you Mason? I think we both know that's not true. Before he could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Mason moved to the window, peering cautiously around the edge. They've found the entrance to the canyon, he reported, his mind racing through their limited options. We need to move deeper into the settlement, find somewhere more defensible. He returned to Eleanor, helping her to her feet. As he did, her blindfold shifted slightly, and he caught a glimpse of her eyes beneath, not clouded or damaged as he'd expected, but clear and alert. Mason froze. Your eyes, he said slowly. You're not blind. Eleanor's hand flew to the blindfold, adjusting it quickly. Mason, please. I can explain. You've been lying about that too? He stepped back, anger flaring hot in his chest. What game are you playing, Eleanor? No game, she insisted, reaching for him. I wear this for protection. The bandits, they can't know I can see. It's the only thing keeping us alive, us. Mason, there is no us, Eleanor. There hasn't been for 8 years, not since you chose Harrington's money over waiting for me. Pain flashed across her face. Is that what you think happened, Mason? They told me you were dead. Your own captain delivered the news himself. He gave me your bloodstain tags, told me you'd died a hero at Shiloh. Mason stared at her, confusion warring with the anger and hurt that had festered for nearly a decade. That's impossible. I was wounded at Shiloh badly enough that they sent me home after months in a field hospital, but I wasn't killed. Then why would? Eleanor began. But the sudden crash of the cabin door flying open cut her words short. The red-headed bandit stood in the doorway, blood staining his shirt where Mason's bullet had grazed his shoulder, his gun aimed directly at Mason's chest. Found you? He growled, a twisted smile revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Now, hand over the map, or I put a bullet through both of you. Mason shifted subtly, placing himself between Eleanor and the gunman. His own weapon was holstered, and he knew he couldn't draw before the bandit fired. You're making a mistake, Mason said evenly. Whatever you think she has, it's not worth killing over. The bandit laughed, an ugly sound that echoed in the small cabin. That's where you're wrong, mister. That silver mine's worth 100 killings. Behind Mason, Eleanor had gone very still. Then, in a movement so swift it caught both men by surprise, she tore off her blindfold and threw it at the bandit's face. The momentary distraction was all Mason needed. He lunged forward, tackling the man as his gun discharged, the bullet splintering the wooden wall. They crashed to the floor in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the weapon. Mason was stronger, but the bandit fought with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. The gun went off again, deafeningly loud in the confined space. Both men froze. Then slowly a crimson stain bloomed across the bandit's chest. His eyes widened in surprise before the light in them dimmed forever. Mason pushed himself away from the body, breathing hard. When he looked up, Eleanor stood watching him, her eyes, those deep brown eyes he'd once lost himself in, fully visible and filled with a complex mixture of fear and determination. We need to go, she said, already gathering her belongings. The others will have heard the shots. Mason rose to his feet, staring at her as if seeing a stranger. You have a lot of explaining to do. I know, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily, and I will. But first, we need to survive. They fled through the back of the cabin just as the remaining bandits converged on the front. Mason grabbed Eleanor's hand, pulling her through the maze of dilapidated structures that made up the abandoned settlement. His mind raced with each step, 3 bullets left, 4 armed men in pursuit. Miles of wilderness between them and the nearest town, and a woman whose every word now seemed suspect. This way, Eleanor whispered, tugging him toward a narrow path that snaked up the canyon wall. Her movements were sure, her eyes scanning their surroundings with practiced efficiency. Gone was any trace of the helpless blind woman he'd rescued hours earlier. Mason followed her lead, questions burning on his tongue, but survival came first. They scrambled up the rocky path, loose stones clattering down behind them. Eleanor moved with surprising agility, her skirts hitched above her ankles, revealing worn leather boots beneath the fine fabric of her dress. There's a cave, she panted, pointing to a dark opening half hidden by scraggly brush. James mapped it, said it connects to tunnels the miners dug. They reached the cave entrance just as shouts erupted below. The bandits had discovered their escape route. Mason ushered Eleanor inside, then pulled the brush across the opening to conceal it. The interior was pitch black. the air cool and damp against their heated skin. "We need light," Mason muttered, patting his pockets for matches. Eleanor reached into her bag and produced a small tin. "Here," she said, pressing it into his palm. Their fingers brushed, and even in the darkness, Mason felt the jolt of awareness that shot through him. He pulled away abruptly. The match flared to life, illuminating Eleanor's face in its warm glow. Without the blindfold, her eyes reflected the tiny, flame-deep brown, flecked with gold, just as he remembered. But there were new lines at their corners, a wariness that hadn't been there before. "We should go deeper," she suggested. "Follow the tunnel. It might lead to another exit." Mason lit a small lantern he found abandoned on a ledge, then gestured for Eleanor to lead the way. As they moved deeper into the mountain, the sounds of pursuit faded behind them. "Start talking," Mason said finally, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow passage. "Why the charade with the blindfold? And how did you know about this place?" Eleanor slowed her pace but didn't turn to face him. "After James died, men started appearing at our house in Denver. At first, they claimed to be business associates offering condolences, but their questions always turned to his papers, his investments." She paused, ducking beneath a low-hanging rock. "Then the break-ins began. Someone was searching for something. It wasn't until I found James's journal that I understood what." "The silver mine," Mason supplied. She nodded. "James had discovered it on a surveying expedition years ago. He bought the claim quietly but never developed it. It was ... waiting for something. He became paranoid near the end, convinced people were watching him." "Sounds like he was right." "Yes." Eleanor's voice was soft. "After the third break-in, I found a letter he'd left for me hidden in a false bottom of his desk. It explained everything, the mine, its value, and the deed's location. It also warned me that men would kill for it." She glanced back at Mason, her face half in shadow. "He said if trouble came, I should find a man named Silas Holt in Copperhead Junction. That Holt would protect me in the claim." Mason frowned. "Silas Holt? The gunslinger? You know him?" "Of him. He's got a reputation." Mason's jaw tightened. "So you took the deed and ran. But that doesn't explain the blindfold." Eleanor stopped at a fork in the tunnel, considering each branch before choosing the right one. "I took a stagecoach from Denver. 2 days into the journey, I noticed we were being followed. The driver saw them too. Said they were Quade Donovan's men." "The railroad baron?" "The same. He wants the land for a new line he's planning." "The silver would be a bonus." Eleanor's voice hardened. "That night at a way station, I overheard 2 passengers talking, saying how Donovan had men on every stage line watching for a woman traveling alone with valuable papers." "So you became blind," Mason concluded. "A disguise. It worked for a while. People see what they expect to see. A blind woman isn't a threat. Isn't someone carrying valuable secrets." Her voice caught. "But then our stage was attacked yesterday. The driver was killed. The other passengers were taken hostage while they searched the coach. When they found nothing, they left me behind, thinking a blind woman would die in the desert before she could tell anyone what happened. They emerged into a larger chamber where several tunnels converged. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, the sound echoing eerily." Mason raised the lantern, illuminating rough walls embedded with quartz veins that sparkled in the light. "And then I found you," Mason said quietly. "Or you found me." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "I didn't know it would be you, Mason. Of all people in this godforsaken territory." She shook her head, a humorless laugh escaping her. 8 years believing you're dead, and you appear like a ghost when I need saving." "About that," Mason said, his voice hardening. "You claim someone told you I died at Shiloh. Who?" "Captain Lawrence Harrington, James's cousin." Eleanor's gaze was steady. "He came to my father's house in uniform. He had your identification tags, Mason. They were covered in blood." Mason's blood ran cold. "Harrington," he repeated. "Of course. It makes sense now. What does..." "I never received any of your letters after Shiloh. Why mine to you went unanswered." He stepped closer, studying her face in the lantern light. "I was gravely wounded. Took a bullet meant for my commanding officer. They sent me to a field hospital, then home to recover. I wrote to you every week for months. When I finally healed enough to travel, I came back to find you married to James Harrington, living in his mansion while I could barely walk without a cane." Eleanor's face paled. "I never received any letters. Not one. They told me you were dead, Mason. Why would I question it? Lawrence was an officer, a gentleman. He had your tags. Tags that were stolen from me while I lay unconscious in that hospital." Mason cut in. "I thought they'd been lost in the chaos. Never occurred to me someone would use them to declare me dead." Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. "Lawrence and James," she whispered. "They wanted me to believe that I wasn't coming back," Mason finished. "So you'd accept James's proposal." Eleanor leaned against the rough stone wall, her composure cracking for the first time. "I didn't want to marry him, Mason, but my father, after you left, his business began failing. James offered to save him from ruin, but only if you became Mrs. Harrington," Mason said bitter. "So you sacrificed yourself. I had no choice." Eleanor's voice rose, echoing in the chamber. "And you were dead, or so I believe. For 8 years I've mourned you while you've been alive, hating me." Mason turned away, unable to look at her. The truth was too painful, too raw. They had both been pawns in a game they hadn't known they were playing. The sound of distant voices brought their argument to an abrupt halt. Mason extinguished the lantern immediately, plunging them into darkness. "They found the tunnel," he whispered, reaching for Eleanor in the blackness. His hand found her arm, and he pulled her close. "We need to keep moving," Mason. Eleanor breathed, her voice inches from his face. "I swear to you, had I known you were alive, it doesn't matter now." He he interrupted, though the words felt like glass in his throat. The past is done. Let's focus on surviving the present. But as they moved deeper into the mountain's labyrinth, Mason knew he was lying to Eleanor and to himself. The past was never done. It was breathing down their necks as surely as the men who hunted them through the darkness. They moved through the darkness with only touch to guide them, Mason's hand gripping Eleanor's tightly as they navigated the winding tunnels. He dared not light the lantern again, not with the echoes of their pursuers growing louder behind them. The air grew colder and damper the deeper they went, the passageway narrowing until they were forced to walk single file, shoulders brushing against rough stone walls. The tunnels should widen soon, Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. James's notes mentioned a large chamber with an underground spring. Mason grunted in acknowledgement, trying to ignore how naturally her hand fit in his. How familiar her touch felt, even after all these years. Your husband seems to have been quite thorough in his exploration of this place. James was meticulous about everything. Eleanor replied, a note of defensiveness in her voice. It's what made him successful in business, and in stealing other men's futures. Mason muttered before he could stop himself. Eleanor's hand stiffened in his. That's not fair. You don't know what it was like. You're right, Mason cut in, regretting his words immediately. I don't know, and now's not the time to discuss it. He paused, listening. The sounds of pursuit had faded momentarily. How long were you married to him? There was a long silence before Eleanor answered. 7 years, 4 months, and 12 days. The precision of her answer struck Mason like a physical blow. Had she been counting the days, waiting for freedom from a marriage she hadn't wanted? Before he could respond, the tunnel suddenly opened into a vast chamber, the darkness so complete that it felt like stepping into a void. The sound of water echoed softly, a gentle rippling that suggested a pool or stream nearby. Wait here, Mason instructed, releasing Eleanor's hand. He struck a match, cupping the flame carefully to minimize its visibility. The flickering light revealed a cathedral-like cavern, its ceiling lost in shadows above. Crystal formations hung like frozen waterfalls, glittering faintly in the match's glow. At the center lay a small, dark pool fed by a trickle of water from somewhere high above. The chamber had multiple exits. At least 3 tunnel mouths gaped in the rock walls. It's beautiful, Eleanor breathed, stepping closer to Mason. The match burned down, singeing his fingers, and Mason dropped it, plunging them back into darkness. He lit another, turning to examine the tunnel entrances. Which way? He asked. Eleanor withdrew the map from her bag, unfolding it carefully. According to this, the rightmost tunnel eventually leads to an exit on the far side of the mountain, but it's the longest route. And the others? The left one is a dead end. The middle one? She hesitated. James marked it as unstable covens. A shout echoed from the tunnel they'd just exited, followed by the orange glow of approaching torches. Their pursuers were getting closer. Right tunnel it is, Mason decided, taking Eleanor's arm. Quickly now. They had barely crossed half the chamber when a gunshot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off stone near their feet. Mason whirled, drawing his revolver and firing a single shot toward the approaching light. The darkness worked both ways. Their attackers could see the match flame, but couldn't aim precisely. Run! Mason urged, pushing Eleanor toward the rightmost tunnel. They plunged into the passage as more shots echoed behind them. Mason lit the lantern once more. Stealth was no longer an option, and they needed to move quickly without breaking their necks on the uneven ground. The tunnel twisted and turned, sometimes so low they had to crouch, other times opening into small chambers cluttered with abandoned mining equipment. Eleanor moved with surprising speed, her skirts gathered in one hand, the other clutching the precious map. They're still following, Mason said grimly, hearing distant shouts. How much farther to the exit? Eleanor consulted the map quickly. Miles, I think. This tunnel winds all through the mountain. Mason cursed under his breath. Their lead wouldn't last. Not with men who knew these tunnels hunting them, and he had only 2 bullets left. They pushed on, the terrain growing increasingly difficult. In places, the floor had collapsed into lower tunnels, forcing them to skirt narrow ledges. Water dripped constantly from above, making the footing treacherous. After what felt like hours, they paused in a small alcove, both breathing hard. Mason set the lantern on a fallen timber and checked his revolver for the 100th time. 2 bullets. No miracle had multiplied them. We need to rest, Eleanor said, sinking down against the wall. Just for a moment. Mason nodded reluctantly. A few minutes. No more. In the lantern light, he studied her face. Dirt smudged her cheeks, and her once elegant dress was torn at the hem, muddied beyond salvation. Yet she held herself with the same dignity he remembered from their youth back, when she'd been the banker's beautiful daughter, and he, the ambitious young rancher, determined to prove himself worthy of her. What happened to you after the war, Mason? Eleanor asked softly, breaking into his thoughts. When you found I was married, ... where did you go? Mason leaned against the opposite wall, keeping his eyes on the tunnel they'd traversed. West, as far as I could get from Willow Creek and its memories. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, tried my hand at prospecting. He shrugged. Eventually saved enough to buy a small spread in Arizona territory. Had 3 good years before the drought came, and now I'm riding to Copperhead Junction with empty pockets and a bank notice saying, I've got 2 weeks before they take everything. The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. Eleanor's eyes softened. I'm sorry, Mason. Truly, life happens, he replied gruffly. No use crying over it. Is there someone waiting for you? A wife? Children? Her voice was careful, controlled. Mason gave a short, humorless laugh. No, never found anyone who He stopped, unwilling to admit the truth, that no woman had ever measured up to his memories of her. No, he finished simply. There's no one. A complex emotion flickered across Eleanor's face, relief, perhaps, or regret. Before she could respond, a distant rumble shook the tunnel, dislodging small stones from the ceiling. What was that? She whispered, rising quickly to her feet. Coven? Mason said grimly, grabbing the lantern. They might be using dynamite to flush us out. Another rumble, louder this time. Dust filled the air, and a larger rock crashed down nearby. We have to move, Mason urged, taking Eleanor's hand. Now, they hurried forward, the tunnel growing narrower and more unstable with each step. Behind them, the sounds of collapse grew louder, a cascade of falling rock that seemed to be gaining on them like a predator. Suddenly, the ground beneath Eleanor's feet gave way. She screamed as she pitched forward into darkness, her hand tearing from Mason's grasp. He lunged for her, catching her wrist at the last moment, the lantern clattering to the ground beside him. Hold on, he shouted, bracing himself against the crumbling edge of what was now revealed to be a deep pit. Eleanor dangled below, her feet kicking at empty air, her face white with terror in the fallen lantern's glow. With a strength born of desperation, Mason pulled her up, inch by agonizing inch, as the tunnel continued to collapse around them. Finally, he managed to haul her back onto solid ground, cradling her against his chest as rocks continued to fall. Are you hurt? He demanded, his heart pounding wildly. Eleanor shook her head, trembling violently in his arms. No, number, I don't think so. The rumbling intensified. Looking back, Mason saw that the tunnel behind them was completely blocked by fallen debris. Their pursuers wouldn't be following, but neither could they retreat. The lantern, Eleanor gasped, pointing. Mason turned to see it teetering on the edge of the pit, its light flickering as the oil sloshed inside. Before he could reach it, another tremor shook the ground, and the lantern toppled into the darkness below, its light swallowed by the abyss. They were plunged into absolute darkness. We have to keep going, Mason said, helping Eleanor to her feet. Can you walk? I think so, she replied, her voice unsteady. She took a tentative step and gasped in pain. My ankle. I must have twisted it when I fell. Without hesitation, Mason swept her into his arms. She felt as light as she had earlier that day when he'd carried her away from the bandits in the canyon. Mason, you can't. I can, he said firmly. And I will. Hold on to me. I'll get us out of here. Eleanor's arms encircled his neck, her face pressed against his shoulder. In the pitch darkness, with danger on all sides and a woman he'd once loved in his arms, Mason Reed began the long journey forward, one careful step at a time. Darkness enveloped them like a living thing, pressing against their skin, filling their lungs with each breath. Mason moved forward cautiously, one arm supporting Eleanor's back, the other beneath her knees, her weight a constant reminder of his purpose. Without sight to guide him, he relied on instinct and touch, his boots testing each step before committing his weight. Keep talking, he instructed Eleanor, his voice echoing strangely in the blackness. Your voice will help me gauge the dimensions of the tunnel. What should I say? She asked, her breath warm against his neck. Anything. Tell me about Denver, your life there. He paused, then added more softly. Tell me what I missed. Eleanor was silent for a moment, and Mason felt her body tense slightly in his arms. Then she began to speak, her voice measured and careful at first, then gradually warming as memories flowed. Denver was beautiful in its way. Not like Willow Creek everything there is new, raw, ambitious. James built us a house on Capitol Hill, 3 stories with a solarium and a library. She paused as Mason navigated a particularly narrow section of tunnel. I filled it with books and plants, trying to make it feel like home. It never quite did. You always loved books, Mason murmured, remembering summers spent reading poetry beneath the willows by the creek, her head in his lap as he played with her hair. James encouraged it. He was kind in his way. Her voice grew softer. He never loved me, Mason. Not really. I was an acquisition, like his businesses or his art collection. Something to display and maintain. Mason's jaw tightened. Then why my father was ruined after you left, she explained, anticipating his question. The bank failed. He'd made loans to Confederate sympathizers who defaulted when the war turned. By the time James offered marriage, we were weeks away from losing everything. Her hand tightened on Mason's shoulder. My father would have gone to debtor's prison. My mother was ill. What choice did I have? The tunnel widened slightly, and Mason felt a faint movement of air against his face, a good sign, suggesting they might be approaching an exit or at least a larger chamber. There's always a choice, Eleanor, he said, more harshly than he intended. Like the choice you made to enlist without telling me? She retorted, sudden fire in her voice. I woke one morning to find a letter saying you'd joined up, that you'd be back when the fighting was done. You didn't even say goodbye. The accusation hit Mason like a physical blow. I thought... He stopped, gathering his thoughts. I thought it was the honorable thing, to help end the conflict quickly, then return to build our life together. The recruiter said it would be over in months. Months that turned into years, Eleanor said bitterly. While you were gone, half the townsmen left for the war. Businesses closed, the railroad construction stopped. Everything we'd planned, everything we'd saved for, it all fell apart. Mason had no answer for that. The war had changed everything, not just for them, but for the entire country. Young men had marched off with dreams of glory, returning if they returned at all, as haunted shadows of themselves. They continued in silence for a time, the only sounds their breathing and the occasional drip of water from unseen heights. Mason's arms began to ache, but he refused to set Eleanor down. The ankle she'd twisted might be worse than she admitted, and in this perfect darkness they couldn't afford another injury. "I wrote to you," Eleanor said finally, her voice small in the vast darkness. "Every week for 6 months. Then the letters started coming back marked return to sender with no explanation. After that, when Lawrence came with your tags and the news of your death ... single quotes, she trailed off. I tried to die too in my way. Stopped eating, wouldn't leave my room. My father feared for my sanity." Mason swallowed hard, imagining her grief a mirror of his own when he'd returned to find her married. "I wrote too," he said quietly, "even from the hospital. Pages about what we'd do when I returned, the ranch we'd build, the family we'd start. I never received a single one." Eleanor's voice cracked. "Not one, Mason Harrington," Mason growled. "Both of them. Lawrence must have intercepted my letters at the camp post, and James made sure yours never reached me. But why go to such lengths? I was just a banker's daughter from a small town." Mason navigated around what felt like a fallen timber, adjusting Eleanor in his arm. "You were never just anything, Eleanor. You were everything. And James Harrington wanted what I had." The simple truth of it hung between them, a ghost of what might have been. The air was definitely fresher now, with a subtle scent of pine and earth. Mason increased his pace slightly, hope kindling that they might be nearing an exit. His foot struck something metallic, an abandoned rail for ore carts, perhaps confirming they were still in a main tunnel. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor whispered suddenly. Mason froze, listening intently. First he heard nothing beyond their own breathing. Then a faint but distinct sound of water, not just dripping but flowing with some force. "A stream," he said. "Or maybe a waterfall," Eleanor finished. The map showed an underground waterfall near the eastern exit. Mason moved toward the sound, his steps more confident now that they had a direction. The ground began to slope downward, and the air grew noticeably damper. The sound of rushing water increased until it filled the tunnel with its steady roar. Without warning, the darkness before them was broken by the faintest glimmer of light, silvery and ethereal, like moonlight-filled clouds. "Mason," Eleanor breathed, her hand tightening on his shoulder. "Look." They emerged into a vast cavern, easily 3 times the size of the chamber they'd passed through earlier. A shaft of moonlight pierced the darkness from a narrow fissure high above, illuminating a spectacular waterfall that cascaded from the cavern wall into a deep, dark pool. The water caught the light as it fell, creating a shimmering curtain that cast dancing reflections on the stone walls. Mason carefully set Eleanor down on a flat boulder near the edge of the pool, both of them momentarily transfixed by the unexpected beauty of this hidden place. "It's like something from a dream," Eleanor murmured, her face softened by the gentle light, with dirt smudging her cheeks and her hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. She looked younger somehow, more like the girl he'd fallen in love with than the sophisticated woman who'd opened her door to find him on her porch, returned from the dead. Mason sank down beside her, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. "We should rest here a while," he said, glancing up at the fissure that admitted the moonlight. "Must be night outside. We'll continue at first light." Eleanor nodded, then winced as she tried to shift her injured ankle into a more comfortable position. Without asking permission, Mason gently lifted her foot onto his lap and began to unlace her boot. "This might hurt," he warned, carefully easing the footwear off. Eleanor bit her lip but made no sound as the boot came free. Her ankle was swollen but not grossly misshapen, a sprain rather than a break, Mason judged with relief. "It needs cold," he said, glancing at the pool. Shrugged out of his vest, tore a strip from the lining and moved to the water's edge to soak it. As he knelt by the dark pool, something caught his eye, a glint of metal half buried in the sand. Curiously, he reached for it, pulling it free. It was a pocket watch, silver and intricately engraved, its chain still attached. Mason turned it over in his palm, wiping away the grit that obscured its surface. When he saw the initials engraved on the back, his blood ran cold. James Harrington. Mason stared at the watch, then at Eleanor, who was watching him with a questioning expression. "Mason, what is it?" He rose slowly, the wet cloth forgotten, and returned to her side. Wordlessly, he held out the watch. Eleanor's face drained of color as she took it from it. "This is impossible," she whispered, her fingers trembling as they traced the familiar initials. "James never came here. He said the tunnels were too dangerous, that he'd only mapped them based on the miners' accounts." "Then how did his watch end up here?" Mason asked, his earlier suspicions about her story resurfacing. Eleanor's eyes met his, wide with confusion and something that looked like fear. "I don't know," she said, "but I'm starting to think my husband had many secrets he never shared with me." The moonlight caught the tears suddenly glistening in her eyes, including why he really wanted this silver mine, why men are willing to kill for it. Mason paced the edge of the underground pool, his mind churning with possibilities, none of them good. Eleanor sat where he'd left her, turning her husband's watch over in her hand, her face troubled in the silvery moonlight. "He must have come here," she said finally, breaking the tense silence. "But why would he lie about it?" Mason paused in his pacing. "Maybe the mine holds more than silver." Eleanor looked up sharply. "What do you mean? Men like Donovan don't send hired guns after a widow for a routine silver claim. And your husband was clearly keeping secrets." Mason gestured toward the watch. You said yourself he became paranoid near the end. Eleanor's fingers closed around the timepiece. 2 weeks before he died, James locked himself in his study for 3 days. When he finally emerged, he looked ... haunted. That's when he wrote the letter about the mine and hid it where only I would find it. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. He told me if anything happened to him, I should take the deed and map to Silas Holt immediately, that my life might depend on it. Did he expect to die? Mason asked, crouching beside her. The pneumonia came on suddenly, but yes, sometimes I wondered ... single quotes. She trailed off, unable to voice the darker suspicion. Mason's jaw tightened. You think he was murdered? Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes troubled. The doctor said it was the fastest moving case he'd ever seen. Within days, James couldn't breathe. Before he died, he tried to tell me something, but he could barely speak. She swallowed hard. His last words were the mine and careful. Then he was gone. A chill that had nothing to do with the cavern's cool air ran down Mason's spine. He rose and moved to the pool again, studying the area where he'd found the watch more carefully. The sand around the pool's edge bore no footprints, besides his own years of flooding had erased any trace of previous visitors. But if James Harrington had been here, what had he discovered? We need to examine the map more closely, Mason said, returning to Eleanor's side. She withdrew the folded parchment from her bag, spreading it carefully on the flat stone between them. In the moonlight, the faded ink was barely visible, but Mason could make out the network of tunnels, chambers, and natural features that comprised the mine complex. Here's where we are, Eleanor said, pointing to a large chamber marked with a waterfall symbol, and this appears to be the exit, perhaps half a mile further. Her finger traced a path through several more chambers to a point marked with an X. Mason frowned, noticing something odd about the map. These markings here, he said, indicating tiny symbols scattered throughout the drawing. What are they? Eleanor leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. I'm not sure. I thought they were surveyor's notations. Mason studied them more intently. They appeared at regular intervals along certain tunnels and chambers. Small crosses that might have been mistaken for distance markers or geological feature. But their placement seemed deliberate, almost like ... A code, he said suddenly. These aren't random markings, they're a message. Eleanor looked skeptical. What kind of message? I'm not sure yet. Mason's mind raced. But I've seen something similar before. During the war, we used maps with hidden markings to indicate supply caches or safe houses. Only those who knew the key could interpret them. Eleanor studied the markings with renewed interest. James was a surveyor before he became a businessman. He would know how to encode information in a map. She hesitated, then added softly. He was also a Union contractor during the war. Mason's head snapped up. What? He supplied the Union Army with boots and uniforms, Eleanor explained. That's how he met Lawrence, through military contracts. A cold suspicion formed in Mason's mind. When exactly did James discover this mine? Eleanor thought for a moment. He claimed it was during a surveying expedition in '63, but I never saw any documentation from that time. '63, Mason repeated, right in the middle of the war. Their eyes met, a shared realization dawning between them. You think the mine is connected to the war somehow? Eleanor asked. Before Mason could respond, a distant sound echoed through the cavern, the unmistakable crack of a falling stone. Both froze, listening intently. Another sound followed, this one clearer. Voices. They've found another way in, Mason whispered, quickly folding the map and returning it to Eleanor. We need to move. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she tested her injured ankle. It would bear some pressure, but she couldn't move quickly or quietly on her own. The exit, she said, nodding toward the far side of the chamber where a dark opening yawned in the rock wall. It's our only chance. Single quotes. Mason hesitated, glancing up at the shaft of moonlight. If they could somehow reach that opening. No, Eleanor said, reading his thoughts. It's too high, and even if we could climb it, we'd be exposed on the mountainside with nowhere to run. She was right. With a nod, Mason guided her toward the tunnel that promised eventual escape. As they reached its mouth, Eleanor paused, looking back at the shimmering waterfall. Wait, she said. James's watch? Could there be anything inside it? A clue? Mason pulled the timepiece from his pocket where he'd placed it for safekeeping. He hadn't thought to check its interior. Carefully, he pressed the release catch and the cover sprang open. Inside, the watch face was unremarkable. The hand stopped at 3:17. But when Mason tilted it toward the moonlight, he noticed something etched into the inner cover, tiny letters scratched with what must have been the point of a knife. Beneath the falls, he read aloud, squinting at the crude inscription. CS Gold. Eleanor's breath caught. CS Confederate States. The voices were growing louder now, accompanied by the flicker of torchlight from one of the tunnels feeding into the chamber. No time to investigate, Mason said grimly, tucking the watch away. But I think we just found out why men are willing to kill for this mine. They slipped into the tunnel just as the first of their pursuers emerged on the far side of the cavern. Mason led Eleanor deeper into the passage, moving as quickly and quietly as her injury would allow. Behind them, shouts of discovery echoed as the men found their trail. The tunnel narrowed and began to ascend, twisting through the heart of the mountain. Without light, they were forced to feel their way forward, one hand on the rough wall, the other clasped tightly together. other. Neither spoke, saving their breath for the grueling climb. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Mason felt a subtle change in the air of freshness that hinted at the outside world. Hope surged through him. "We're getting close," he whispered to Eleanor, who was breathing heavily from the exertion. Just then, his foot struck something on the tunnel floor that clinked metallically. Crouching down, he felt blindly along the ground until his fingers closed around a small object, smooth, cylindrical, familiar, a bullet casing, fresh. By the feel of it, Mason's blood ran cold. Someone had been here recently, very recently, and they had been armed. "Mason?" Eleanor whispered, sensing his tension. "What is it?" Before he could answer, a new sound reached them, not from behind where their pursuers still searched, but from ahead. Boots on stone, the metallic slide of a gun being cocked. "That's far enough," said a rough voice from the darkness ahead. "Hands where I can see them." A match flared, momentarily blinding them with its sudden brightness. As Mason's vision adjusted, he found himself staring down the barrel of a Winchester rifle held by a tall, lean man with a silver star pinned to his dust-covered vest. "Marshal Silas Holt," the man introduced himself, his weathered face impassive in the match's glow. "And you two are in a whole heap of trouble." Eleanor's grip on Mason's arm tightened painfully. "Silas Holt," she repeated. "But that's who James told me to find." The marshal's eyes narrowed as they shifted to Eleanor. "And you would be?" "Eleanor Harrington," she replied, straightening despite her exhaustion. "James Harrington's widow." Something like recognition flickered in Holt's gaze. He lowered the rifle slightly, though his finger remained near the trigger. "Well now," he said slowly, "isn't that interesting? James Harrington told me to expect a visit from his wife." His eyes hardened as they returned to Mason. "He didn't mention she'd be bringing company." Mason paced the edge of the underground pool, his mind churning with possibilities, none of them good. Eleanor sat where he'd left her, turning her husband's watch over in her hand, her face troubled in the silvery moonlight. "He must have come here," she said finally, breaking the tense silence. "But why would he lie about it?" Mason paused in his pacing. "Maybe the mine holds more than silver." Eleanor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Men like Donovan don't send hired guns after a widow for a routine silver claim. And your husband was clearly keeping secrets." Mason gestured toward the watch. "You said yourself he became paranoid near the end." Eleanor's fingers closed around the timepiece. 2 weeks before he died, James locked himself in his study for 3 days. When he finally emerged, he looked ... haunted. That's when he wrote the letter about the mine and hid it where only I would find it. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "He told me if anything happened to him, I should take the deed and map to Silas Holt immediately, that my life might depend on it." "Did he expect to die?" Mason asked, crouching beside her. "The pneumonia came on suddenly. But yes, sometimes I wonder ... Single quotes she trailed off, unable to voice the darker suspicion. Mason's jaw tightened. "You think he was murdered?" Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes troubled. "The doctor said it was the fastest moving case he'd ever seen. Within days, James couldn't breathe. Before he died, he tried to tell me something, but he could barely speak." She swallowed hard. His last words were "the mine and careful." Then he was gone. A chill that had nothing to do with the cavern's cool air ran down Mason's spine. He rose and moved to the pool again, studying the area where he'd found the watch more carefully. The sand around the pool's edge bore no footprints. Besides, his own years of flooding had erased any trace of previous visitors. But if James Harrington had been here, what had he discovered? "We need to examine the map more closely," Mason said, returning to Eleanor's side. She withdrew the folded parchment from her bag, spreading it carefully on the flat stone between them. In the moonlight, the faded ink was barely visible, but Mason could make out the network of tunnels, chambers, and natural features that comprised the mine complex. "Here's where we are," Eleanor said, pointing to a large chamber marked with a waterfall symbol. "And this appears to be the exit, perhaps half a mile further." Her finger traced a path through several more chambers to a point marked with an X. Mason frowned, noticing something odd about the map. "These markings here," he said, indicating tiny symbols scattered throughout the drawing. "What are they?" Eleanor leaned closer, squinting in the dim light. "I'm not sure. I thought they were surveyor's notations." Mason studied them more intently. They appeared at regular intervals along certain tunnels and chambers, small crosses that might have been mistaken for distance. Markers or geological features, but their placement seemed deliberate, almost like ... "A code," he said suddenly. "These aren't random markings, they're a message." Eleanor looked skeptical. "What kind of message?" "I'm not sure yet," Mason's mind raced, "but I've seen something similar before. During the war, we used maps with hidden markings to indicate supply caches or safe houses. Only those who knew the key could interpret them." Eleanor studied the markings with renewed interest. James was a surveyor before he became a businessman. He would know how to encode information in a map. She hesitated, then added softly, "He was also a union contractor during the war." Mason's head snapped up. "What?" "He supplied the Union Army with boots and uniforms," Eleanor explained. "That's how he met Lawrence, through military contracts." A cold suspicion formed in Mason's mind. When exactly did James discover this mine? Eleanor thought for a moment. "He claimed it was during a surveying expedition in '63, but I never saw any documentation from that time." "'63, Mason repeated. "Right in the middle of the war." Their eyes met, a shared realization dawning between them. "You think the mine is connected to the war somehow?" Eleanor asked. Before Mason could respond, a distant sound echoed through the cavern, the unmistakable crack of a falling stone. Both froze, listening intently. Another sound followed, this one clearer. Voices. "They've found another way in," Mason whispered, quickly folding the map and returning it to Eleanor. "We need to move." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she tested her injured ankle. It would bear some pressure, but she couldn't move quickly or quietly on her own. "The exit," she said, nodding toward the far side of the chamber where a dark opening yawned in the rock wall. "It's our only chance." Single quotes. Mason hesitated, glancing up at the shaft of moonlight. "If they could somehow reach that opening. No," Eleanor said, reading his thoughts. "It's too high, and even if we could climb it, we'd be exposed on the mountainside with nowhere to run." She was right. With a nod, Mason guided her toward the tunnel that promised eventual escape. As they reached its mouth, Eleanor paused, looking back at the shimmering waterfall. "Wait," she said. "Yeah, James's watch. Could there be anything inside it? A clue?" Mason pulled the timepiece from his pocket where he'd placed it for safekeeping. He hadn't thought to check its interior. Carefully, he pressed the release catch and the cover sprang open. Inside, the watch face was unremarkable. The hand stopped at 3:17, but when Mason tilted it toward the moonlight, he noticed something etched into the inner cover, tiny letters scratched with what must have been the point of a knife. Beneath the falls, he read aloud, squinting at the crude inscription. "CS Gold." Eleanor's breath caught. "CS? Confederate States?" The voices were growing louder now, accompanied by the flicker of torchlight from one of the tunnels feeding into the chamber. "No time to investigate," Mason said grimly, tucking the watch away. "But I think we just found out why men are willing to kill for this mine." They slipped into the tunnel just as the first of their pursuers emerged on the far side of the cavern. Mason led Eleanor deeper into the passage, moving as quickly and quietly as her injury would allow. Behind them, shouts of discovery echoed as the men found their trail. The tunnel narrowed and began to ascend, twisting through the heart of the mountain. Without light, they were forced to feel their way forward, one hand on the rough wall, the other clasped tightly together. Neither spoke, saving their breath for the grueling climb. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Mason felt a subtle change in the air of freshness that hinted at the outside world. Hope surged through him. "We're getting close," he whispered to Eleanor, who was breathing heavily from the exertion. Just then, his foot struck something on the tunnel floor that clinked metallically. Crouching down, he felt blindly along the ground until his fingers closed around a small object, smooth, cylindrical, familiar, a bullet casing, fresh by the feel of it. Mason's blood ran cold. Someone had been here recently, very recently, and they had been armed. "Mason?" Eleanor whispered, sensing his tension. "What is it?" Before he could answer, a new sound reached them. Not from behind where their pursuers still searched, but from ahead. Boots on stone, the metallic slide of a gun being cocked. "That's far enough," said a rough voice from the darkness ahead. "Hands where I can see them." A match flared, momentarily blinding them with its sudden brightness. As Mason's vision adjusted, he found himself staring down the barrel of a Winchester rifle held by a tall, lean man with a silver star pinned to his dust-covered vest. "Marshal Silas Holt," the man introduced himself, his weathered face impassive in the match's glow. "And you two are in a whole heap of trouble." Eleanor's grip on Mason's arm tightened painfully. "Silas Holt," she repeated. "But that's who James told me to find." The marshal's eyes narrowed as they shifted to Eleanor. "And you would be?" "Eleanor Harrington," she replied, straightening despite her exhaustion. "James Harrington's widow." Something like recognition flickered in Holt's gaze. He lowered the rifle slightly, though his finger remained near the trigger. "Well now," he said slowly, "isn't that interesting? James Harrington told me to expect a visit from his wife." His eyes hardened as they returned to Mason. He didn't mention she'd be bringing company. Marshal Holt's match burned down to his fingertips, and he shook it out with a muttered curse. In the returned darkness, Mason heard the man fumble with something, then a soft hiss as a small lantern flared to life. The marshal held it up, the light casting long shadows on the tunnel walls as he studied them both with narrowed eyes. "We should keep moving," Holt said after a moment. "Your friends back there won't take long to figure out which way you went." He gestured with the rifle. "This tunnel leads out to a ridge above Silver Creek Canyon. I've got horses waiting." Single quotes. Mason felt Eleanor's questioning gaze but kept his own fixed on the marshal. "Why should we trust you?" Holt's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "Because I'm not currently shooting you, which puts me ahead of the alternatives." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded paper, which he handed to Eleanor. "Also because of this," Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers. Mason watched her face as she read, noting how the color drained from her cheeks. "It's James's handwriting," she whispered. "Dated just days before he died." "What does it say?" Mason asked, not taking his eyes off Holt. "Bearer is trusted. Follow without question if circumstances become dire." Eleanor looked up at the marshal. "It's signed with his personal seal." Holt nodded once, as if that settled matters. "I was Harrington's insurance policy. He paid me a considerable sum to watch over this area and wait for either him or his wife to come calling." His gaze sharpened. "Though he never mentioned you'd be in such interesting company, Mrs. Harrington." The distant shouts of their pursuers grew louder, echoing through the tunnel network. Explanations later, Mason said grimly. "Eleanor's injured. She can't move quickly." Without hesitation, Holt handed Mason the lantern and holstered his rifle. "I'll carry her. You keep watch behind us. That Navy Colt of yours still have any rounds?" "Two," Mason replied, surprised the marshal had correctly identified his weapon in the dim light. Holt snorted. "Better make them count." He scooped Eleanor into his arms with practiced ease. "Stay close. The tunnel forks ahead. Wrong turn will drop you into a shaft that hasn't got a bottom worth mentioning. They move swiftly through the darkness, Holt leading with Eleanor in his arms, Mason bringing up the rear, his hand on his revolver. The marshal navigated the winding passage with the confidence of someone who had traveled it many times before. "How long have you been watching the mine?" Mason asked quietly as they rounded a sharp bend. "Long enough to know it's worth more than silver," Holt replied without turning. "Harrington contacted me 6 months ago. Said he'd found something that could get him killed. Needed someone with my particular skills to ensure it didn't." "And what skills are those exactly?" Mason pressed. This time Holt did glance back, his eyes glinting in the lantern light. "I was a scout for the Union Army. Spent 3 years behind enemy lines gathering intelligence. After the war, I found a badge suited me better than farming." His voice hardened. "And I've got a special dislike for men who steal from the dead." Before Mason could ask what he meant, the tunnel opened abruptly onto a narrow ledge cut into the side of the mountain. The night air hit them like a blessing, cool and clean after the stale dampness of the cave. Above, stars glittered in a cloudless sky. Below, the dark shape of a canyon stretched away into the distance, pine trees clustering along its edges like sentinels. Holt set Eleanor down carefully, keeping one arm around her waist to support her. "Horses are tethered just around that bend," he said, nodding toward where the ledge curved around the mountainside. "Can you make it, ma'am?" Eleanor nodded, her face pale but determined in the moonlight. "I'll manage." Mason moved to her other side, and together they helped her along the precarious path. When they rounded the bend, 3 horses stood waiting, tethered to a gnarled pine that somehow found purchase in the rocky soil. "You were expecting company," Mason observed, noting the number of mounts. Holt's expression remained impassive. Harrington's letter mentioned his wife might not come alone. He lifted Eleanor onto the smallest of the horses, a sturdy paint mare with a gentle eye. "Though I was expecting a hired guard, not ... single quotes." He gave Mason an appraising look. "Well, whatever you are to the lady. We knew each other before the war," Eleanor said quietly, adjusting her torn skirts around her in the saddle. "Before I met James." Something like understanding flickered in Holt's eyes. "That explains a few things." He mounted his own horse, a tall black gelding with a white blaze. "We need to ride hard. There's a cabin about 10 miles north where we can hole up until morning." Mason swung into the saddle of the remaining horse, a chestnut with a rebellious toss to its head. "Those men back there, they won't give up easily." "No," Holt agreed grimly. "Not with what's at stake." They set off along a narrow trail that wound down the mountainside, Holt leading, Eleanor in the middle, and Mason bringing up the rear. The night was clear and still. The only sounds the steady clop of hooves on stone and the occasional cry of a hunting owl. Mason guided his mount alongside Eleanor's when the trail widened enough to permit it. In the moonlight, her profile was sharp and delicate, her posture rigid despite her obvious exhaustion. "How's your ankle?" he asked softly. "Throbbing," she admitted, "but I'll survive." He nodded, then asked the question that had been burning in his mind since they'd met the marshal. "Did you know about the gold?" Eleanor's hands tightened on her reins. "No," she said firmly. "James never mentioned anything about Confederate gold. Only the silver mine." She glanced at him, her eyes catching the moonlight. "Do you believe me?" Mason studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "I believe you. But your husband clearly knew, and went to great lengths to secure it. The question is why?" Eleanor murmured. "James was a Union man through and through. If he found Confederate gold, why not turn it over to the government?" "Because legally it might not belong to either side anymore," Holt called back, his hearing evidently sharper than they'd realized. "War's been over for 8 years. Possession becomes 9/10 of the law after a while." "How much gold are we talking about?" Mason asked. Holt shrugged. "Rumors put it at somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million in double eagles, part of the Confederate treasury that went missing after Richmond fell." Mason let out a low whistle. Even the lower estimate represented more wealth than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. "That's why Donovan wants the mine," Eleanor said, understanding dawning in her voice. "Not for a railroad or silver, but for the gold." "Donovan's just a front," Holt replied. "Man like that doesn't do his own dirty work. Question is, who's he working for?" They rode in silence for a time, each lost in their own thoughts. The trail began to level out as they reached the canyon floor, winding through stands of ponderosa pine. Mason kept his senses alert for any sign of pursuit, but the night remained quiet. Almost too quiet. "I still don't understand how James found the gold," Eleanor said eventually, "or why he kept it secret, even from me." "Men keep secrets from their wives for all sorts of reasons, ma'am," Holt remarked. "Sometimes to protect them, sometimes to protect themselves." Single quotes. Mason caught the subtle edge in the marshal's voice. "You didn't much care for Harrington, did you?" Holt was silent for so long that Mason thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, careful. "I respected him. He was smart, forward-thinking. But no, I didn't care for how he operated. Man built his fortune on other people's misfortunes." He glanced back at Eleanor. "Begging your pardon, ma'am." To Mason's surprise, Eleanor nodded. "You needn't apologize for the truth, Marshal. I harbored no illusions about my husband's business practices." Her voice softened, though he was not without conscience, especially toward the end. "That conscience is probably what got him killed," Holt said bluntly. Eleanor's head snapped up. "You believe he was murdered too? Pneumonia that strikes a healthy man and kills him in days?" Holt shook his head. "I've seen poison work that way. Clean, efficient, hard to prove afterward." Mason watched Eleanor's face as she absorbed this confirmation of her suspicions. Despite everything, the years of separation, the pain of betrayal, the marriage to another another man, he found himself wanting to shield her from this fresh grief. If that's true, he said, then whoever killed Harrington knows about the gold, and they'll be expecting us to lead them right to it. Single quotes. Holt reined in his horse at the edge of a small clearing, raising his hand for them to stop, which is why we're not going to do what they expect. He dismounted, helping Eleanor down carefully. Welcome to Redemption, folks. Population currently 3. In the moonlight, Mason could just make out a small cabin nestled among the trees, its chimney dark, its windows shuttered. It looked long abandoned, with wild grass growing up to its porch steps. "This is your safe house?" he asked skeptically. A rare smile crossed Holt's weather-beaten face. Sometimes the best hiding place is the one nobody thinks to look at twice. He led them toward the cabin, supporting Eleanor with a gentle hand beneath her elbow. Besides, it has one feature that makes it particularly valuable right now. "What's that?" Eleanor asked. Holt pushed open the cabin door, revealing a dark interior that smelled of dust and pine. "A cellar with a tunnel that leads to the old stagecoach road. If trouble finds us here, we'll have another way out." As they stepped inside, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He turned, scanning the tree line behind them, but saw nothing besides shadows and starlight. Still, as Holt closed and barred the cabin door, Mason knew with bone-deep certainty that their journey was far from over, and that the worst dangers still lay ahead. Inside the cabin, Holt struck a match and lit an old oil lamp hanging from a ceiling beam. The yellow light revealed a Spartan interior, a rough wooden table with 3 mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace with a cast-iron pot hanging from a hook, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. A layer of dust covered everything, but less than Mason would have expected for a truly abandoned dwelling. "Home sweet home," Holt said dryly, moving to the fireplace. "It gets cold in these mountains at night, even in summer. Best get a fire going." Eleanor sank gratefully onto one of the chairs, extending her injured leg. The ankle had swollen considerably during their ride, straining against the confines of her boot. "Let me help with that," Mason said, kneeling before her. He gently removed the boot and torn stocking, revealing skin mottled with angry purple bruising. "It needs wrapping, and cold if we can manage it." Single quotes. Holt glanced over from where he was arranging kindling. "There's a stream about 50 yards behind the cabin. Water's cold enough to numb bone." He nodded toward a shelf above the fireplace. "Medical supplies in that tin box. I keep this place stocked for emergencies." As Mason retrieved the box, he noticed a framed photograph half hidden behind it, a faded image of a young woman with serious eyes and a small, private smile. He glanced at Holt, curious, but the marshal's expression warned against questions. While Holt built the fire, Mason carried a small bucket to the stream, returning with icy water. He soaked a clean cloth and carefully wrapped it around Eleanor's ankle, then bandaged it firmly with strips from the medical kit. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes following his movements. "You always did have gentle hands. I remember when you splinted that robin's wing at the creek." The memory caught Mason off guard. A spring day, 8 years and several lifetimes ago, when they'd found an injured bird and nursed it back to health together. It had been just weeks before he'd enlisted, before everything changed. "Bird flew away just fine," he replied, keeping his voice neutral as he finished the bandaging. "Some things mend better than others." Eleanor's face fell slightly at his tone, but she said nothing more. Holt had the fire crackling now, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. He filled the iron pot with water from a barrel in the corner and set it to heat. "We've got coffee, jerky, and beans," he announced. "Not fancy, but it'll keep body and soul together." Mason stood, moving to the cabin's single window. He pulled the edge of the shutter back slightly, peering into the darkness. "How long do you think we can stay here?" "Dawn at the latest," Holt replied, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "By then, Donovan's men will have combed every inch of those tunnels and figured out which way we egg. They'll start searching the area." "And then what?" Eleanor asked. "Where do we go?" Holt glanced at the map poking from her bag. "That depends on what your husband's map can tell us about the gold's exact location." Eleanor withdrew the parchment and spread it on the table. The men gathered around her, studying the faded lines and mysterious markings by lamplight. "Here's the waterfall chamber," Mason said, pointing to where they'd found Harrington's watch. The inscription said "Beneath the Falls." Holt nodded. "Makes sense. Perfect hiding place. Water conceals the entrance, keeps people from stumbling on it accidentally. But James's map doesn't show any passage behind or beneath the falls," Eleanor said, frowning. "Just the main chamber. That's where these markings come in," Mason said, indicating the small crosses scattered throughout the drawing. "I'm thinking they're a code. Harrington didn't want anyone to find the gold who didn't already know where to look." Holt studied the markings intently. "They're deliberate, that's for sure. Spaced too regularly to be random." He tapped one finger against the table, thinking. "During the war, we sometimes used biblical references as code, chapter and verse numbers." Eleanor's eyes widened. James kept a Bible in his desk. He wasn't particularly religious, but his father had been a minister. The Bible was a family heirloom. Mason counted the markings quickly. 26 crosses. "Could be chapter and verse combinations, or coordinates," Holt suggested. "Surveyor might think that way." Eleanor suddenly gasped, her finger landing on a tiny notation near the waterfall that they'd overlooked. A small circle with the letters J inside it. "Look," she said. "James's initials." He marked his spot dot. Single quotes. Holt leaned closer. "I'll be damned." The man literally signed his work. Mason squinted at the marking. "It's positioned just behind the falls. slightly to the left. There must be a hidden passage or chamber there. So we go back to the mine, Eleanor said. Find the entrance behind the falls. Not we, Mason corrected firmly. You're staying somewhere safe while Holt and I retrieve the gold. Eleanor's eyes flashed. That's not your decision to make, Mason. This is my husband's legacy, my responsibility. Your husband's legacy is what got us into this mess, Mason retorted. And you can barely walk. I don't need to walk to know what we're looking for, Eleanor shot back. James might have left other clues that only I would recognize. Holt raised a hand, silencing them both. Nobody's going anywhere tonight. We'll figure out the details in the morning. He moved to the fireplace, pouring the now boiling coffee into 3 chipped mugs. For now, drink this and get some rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Single quotes. They accepted the mugs silently. The argument temporarily shelved, but not forgotten. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed Mason's insides and helped clear his exhaustion-fogged mind. How did you end up mixed up with Harrington anyway? He asked Holt after a while, curiosity getting the better of him. The marshal sipped his coffee before answering. Crossed paths during the war. I was gathering intelligence in Tennessee when I stumbled on a Confederate payroll wagon, abandoned after a skirmish. Gold coins, about $20,000 worth. He set his mug down. By the time I reported it to my commanding officer, half the gold had mysteriously disappeared. The officer in charge of securing it was Captain Lawrence Herring. Eleanor's head snapped up. James's cousin? Holt nodded. One and the same. When the war ended, I made it my business to track down what happened to that gold. The trail led me to Lawrence, then to your husband. His weathered face hardened. James Harrington wasn't directly involved in the theft, but he knew about it. He used the information to persuade his cousin to help with certain business arrangements. Like convincing me that Mason was dead, Eleanor whispered, pieces falling into place, and arranging our marriage. Most likely, Holt agreed. Men like that, they collect leverage like some folks collect stamps. Mason's hand tightened around his mug. So when James contacted you about the mine ... single quotes, I figured he'd found something bigger than that initial theft. Holt finished. Something worth killing for. Confederate treasury gold fits the bill. They fell silent, each contemplating the web of deception that had entangled them all. Outside, an owl hooted, the sound carrying clearly in the still night air. Eleanor was the first to speak again. If James knew about the gold all this time, why wait until now? Why not retrieve it years ago? Maybe he couldn't find the exact location, Mason suggested. Or maybe he was waiting for the right moment, or the right allies, Holt added. Gold like that, you can't just waltz into a bank with it. Too many questions. You'd need connections, ways to launder it slowly, which James had, Eleanor said thoughtfully. His business interests expanded significantly in the last 2 years. New partners, investments in mining operations across 3 territories. She looked up, realization dawning. He was setting up the infrastructure to handle the gold, and someone got impatient, Mason concluded grimly, decided to cut him out of the equation. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. In that moment, a sound from outside froze them all, the distant but unmistakable whinny of a horse. Holt was on his feet instantly, extinguishing the lamp with one quick movement. Mason moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. In the moonlight, he could just make out movement at the edge of the clearing, at least 3 mounted figures advancing slowly toward the cabin. They found us, he whispered, drawing his revolver. 3 riders. Maybe more in the trees. Holt cursed under his breath. Must have tracked us from the mine exit. He turned to Eleanor, his voice urgent but controlled. Mrs. Harrington, there's a trapdoor under the rug by the cot. It leads to the cellar and the escape tunnel. Take the map and go. The tunnel comes out about a mile south, near a lightning-struck pine. Wait for us there. Eleanor gathered her things quickly, her face pale but determined. What about you two? We'll buy you time, Mason said, moving to help her to the trapdoor. Then follow as soon as we can. Their eyes met in the dimness, and for a moment everything between them, the years, the pain, the misunderstanding, seemed to fall away. On impulse, Eleanor reached up and pressed her palm to his cheek, her touch warm against his skin. Don't make me mourn you twice, Mason Reed, she whispered. Mason helped Eleanor through the trapdoor, his heart hammering against his ribs as her words echoed in his mind. Don't make me mourn you twice. He closed the door quietly behind her, hearing her soft footsteps descend the ladder to the cellar below. Hope that tunnel's as good as you say it is, he murmured to Holt, who was positioning himself by the window, Winchester at the ready. Used it twice before, the marshal replied. It'll hold. He peered through the crack in the shutters. They're spreading out, 4 of them now that I can see. Mason moved to the other window, his navy Colt feeling woefully inadequate against the odds they faced. 2 bullets, he reminded Holt. Make that 5 between us. Holt's weathered face creased in a grim smile. Been in worse spots with less. Somehow I believe that, Mason said, finding unexpected comfort in the older man's calm confidence. Outside, the riders had halted about 30 yards from the cabin. In the moonlight, Mason could make out the red-haired leader from the canyon, his shoulder bandaged where Mason's bullet had struck him earlier. Beside him sat a tall figure on a white horse, too far away to see clearly, but carrying himself with an authority that marked him as more than a hired gun. That'll be Clayton Wheeler, Holt said, nodding toward the man on the white horse. Donovan's head of security, ex-military, mean as a rattlesnake with a toothache, crossed paths during the war. He was on the wrong side of more than just the Masonics in line. Holt's voice hardened. He's the type who enjoys his work too much. As if on cue, Wheeler's voice carried across the clearing. Marshal Holt, I know you're in there. You and Reed and the widow Harrington. His tone was conversational, almost pleasant. Let's handle this like civilized folks. Send the woman out with the map and you two can ride away. No hard feeling. Mason and Holt exchanged glances but remained silent. Not feeling talkative, Wheeler called after a pause. Understandable, but consider your position. We've got you outnumbered and surrounded. That old cabin won't stand up to much punishment. The white horse pranced nervously beneath him. The lady doesn't need to get hurt. None of you do. He's stalling, Holt whispered. Probably has men circling around back. Mason nodded, reaching the same conclusion. How long do you think Eleanor needs to get clear? 5 minutes? Maybe 10, Holt replied. Tunnel's not complicated, but it's a tight squeeze in places. Mason considered their limited options. We could try to slip out after her, or make a stand here. Stand buys her more time, Holt said decisively. We hold them here as long as possible, then follow if we can. Outside, Wheeler's patience was wearing thin. Last chance, gentlemen. I'm not asking again. Holt took a deep breath, then called out, The widow's not here, Wheeler. Just me and Reed. She took the stage to Tucson this morning. A bark of laughter answered him. Nice try, Marshal. We tracked 3 horses to this cabin not an hour ago. There was a pause. Then, have it your way. The first shot shattered the window beside Mason's head, showering him with splinters and glass. He ducked instinctively, then returned fire, his bullet splintering the trunk of a pine near Wheeler's position. Holt fired as well. A more measured shot that found its mark in one of the mounted men, who tumbled from his saddle with a cry. 3-2 now, Holt said grimly, working the lever on his Winchester. Still not odds I'd bet on, Mason replied, moving to a different position as bullets began to pepper the cabin walls. The firefight intensified, wood splintering as rounds tore through the thin walls. Mason and Holt returned fire sparingly, making each shot count. Another of Wheeler's men fell, clutching his leg and crawling for cover behind a fallen log. Then came an ominous silence. Mason tensed, knowing what it likely meant. Moments later, his fears were confirmed as a flaming arrow arced through the night sky, embedding itself in the cabin's shake-shingled roof with a dull thud. Fire, he muttered. Should have expected that. Single quotes. Holt glanced up as sparks began to drift down from the ceiling. Time to consider that strategic retreat, he suggested, backing toward the trapdoor. Ladies first. Mason nodded, crouching low as he made his way across the cabin. He'd just reached the rug when the door burst open, kicked in by the red-haired bandit who'd accosted Eleanor in the canyon. The man fired wildly, his shot going wide as Mason threw himself sideways. Holt's rifle cracked and the redhead staggered, dropping his pistol as blood blossomed on his chest. But even as he fell, more figures appeared in the doorway, Wheeler himself and 2 others. Guns drawn. Down! Holt shouted, shoving Mason roughly toward the floor as bullets filled the air where he'd been standing. Mason rolled behind the table, flipping it onto its side for cover. His last bullet took one of Wheeler's men in the shoulder, spinning him back out the door. Holt fired twice more in quick succession, but his Winchester clicked empty after the second shot. Smoke was filling the cabin now, the fire spreading rapidly across the dry timber of the roof. Wheeler advanced cautiously, a revolver in each hand, his lean face illuminated by the growing flames. Where is she? He demanded, his voice cold despite the heat building around them. Where's the widow? Gone, Mason said, rising slowly with his empty gun held loosely at his side. Along with the map. You're too late, Wheeler. Wheeler's eyes narrowed dangerously. Then I guess I have no further use for either of you. He raised one revolver, aiming it squarely at Mason's chest. The shot that rang out didn't come from Wheeler's gun. Instead, the man jerked violently, a look of surprise crossing his face as blood appeared on his shirt front. He turned slowly, revealing Eleanor standing in the doorway, a small derringer clutched in her shaking hand. That's for my husband, she said, her voice barely audible above the crackle of flames. Wheeler sank to his knees, then toppled forward onto the rough-hewn floor. His remaining man took one look at Eleanor, then at his fallen leader, and fled into the night. Eleanor? Mason rushed to her side, taking the small gun from her trembling fingers. You were supposed to be halfway to safety by now. The tunnel collapsed, she explained, coughing as smoke swirled around them. Old timber supports gave way after I'd gone about 50 yards. I had to come back. Her eyes met his, fierce despite her fear. I couldn't leave you. Holt appeared beside them, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Touching reunion, but this place is about to become an oven. We need to move. Outside, flames illuminated the clearing as the cabin roof began to collapse inward. They stumbled away from the inferno, seeking shelter among the trees. Eleanor leaned heavily on Mason, her injured ankle nearly giving way with each step. The horses, she gasped. Did they spooked and ran when the shooting started, Holt said grimly. We're on foot. They made it to the tree line just as the cabin's roof caved in completely, sending a shower of embers into the night sky. Mason helped Eleanor to sit with her back against a broad pine trunk, then sank down beside her, his energy suddenly drained. Wheeler's men? He asked Holt, who remained standing, scanning the darkness around them. Gone for now, but they'll be back with reinforcements once they regroup. The marshal turned to Eleanor. Please tell me you still have the map, Mrs. Harrington. Eleanor nodded, patting her bag. And something else. I found this in the cellar, hidden in a crevice near where the tunnel collapsed. She withdrew a small leather-bound book, its cover worn with age and handling. I think it's James's journal. Holt took it from her, flipping through the pages by the light of the burning cabin. Dates go back to 63, he noted. Right when he supposedly discovered the mine. What does it say? Mason asked, leaning forward despite his exhaustion. Holt turned to the final entries, his expression growing more intent as he read. Well now, he said finally, looking up at them with newfound respect. Seems like James Harrington was a more complicated man than any of us realized. What do you mean, Eleanor? According to this, he wasn't planning to keep the gold for himself at all. Holt handed the journal to Eleanor. He was gathering evidence against his cousin Lawrence and the others involved in the original theft. Planned to return the Confederate Treasury gold to the federal government. Eleanor stared at the journal in disbelief. That's why they killed him, she whispered. Who's going to expose them all? Mason watched her face as she absorbed this revelation about the man she'd been married to for 8 years. A man she'd never truly known, it seemed. There's more, Holt said quietly. Last entry mentions you specifically, Reed. Mason's head snapped up. Me? Why would Harrington write about me? Holt nodded to Eleanor, who was reading the page with trembling fingers. Her voice was soft but steady as she read aloud. Should anything happen to me, Eleanor must find Mason Reed. He alone can be trusted with this task. If he still lives, I stole his future once. Perhaps this is my chance to return it.